And Charles, I'd like to begin with you in the threats to democracy discussion about what you saw in that Trump QAnon gathering and the threat to democracy represented there.
Well, the idea that, half, I always say half when I say Republican Party, it's not really half, but half the electorate, we could possibly say, believes that Donald Trump won or that Biden was not legitimately elected, and now is drifting closer to accepting more of the QAnon conspiracy theories is a danger. I mean, we'd only have two political parties in America. We people often, think about or wonder what it would be like to have more political parties. We have political parties bubble up every now and then, but they don't get enough traction. And that's also because of the way the system is structured. You have to get a certain percentage of the vote to be recognized enough to be put on the debate stage. You have to get a certain percentage of support in order to get federal funding. So the system itself resists having more political parties. We have two. And if one of them is behaving in this way, believing the things that Republicans now say that they believe, you can't describe that as anything other than a threat, and a very serious one.
And Tom, when you saw what was going on at that Trump rally with the QAnon people, your tweet was, these people are worshiping a real estate developer from Queens who can barely hold a thought in his head. This is beyond un-American. It's psychotic. And it is the Electoral College that allows them to capture the presidency. And Donald Trump, unlike any previous presidential politician, has never, ever made an attempt to reach a voter who doesn't already agree with him, because he has no expectation of ever winning the most votes. They just have that route through the Electoral College that they believe they can pull off.
Yeah, when I watched the rally, one of the things that occurred to me is that no matter how much we talk about the Constitution, and I agree that despite being something of a traditionalist about the Constitution, our institutions have to have some kind of reform, have to have some kind of change because of the structural changes in the country. But if we are a country that is collectively becoming subject to a kind of mass psychosis, our institutions can't save us. Structural reforms can't save us. Changing the law can't save us. Starting all over with a new constitution can't save us if we have millions of people whom we need to be voting and participating citizens in the democracy, if they are completely delusional and have lost touch with reality. This goes all the way back to James Madison warning that no checks and balances, no system of government can save us if we become essentially an unvirtuous people. And so that's the thing that really struck me about the rally, is that you can't design a system of government built around people who are staring at television stations or going down internet rabbit holes. There is no hope of creating a constitutional mechanism to deal with that.
But Charles, the majority of Americans are just fine. The majority of Americans think all of that stuff is crazy. The trouble is the founders put elements into the structure of the federal government that allows this crazy minority to govern the majority.
Exactly. The country is broken from the very beginning in its founding documents. And what the Republicans are doing at this point is trying to exploit the brokenness that already exists and to break it even more if need be. We have multiple mass migrations happening in this country. One of them is urbanization, young people, mostly young college-educated white people, reversing the trends that their mothers and fathers and grandparents made and moving out to suburbs and then moving back into cities. They're also moving to bigger, bluer states by and large. And what that means is that every person that shows up in Brooklyn actually weakens the vote of everyone else in Brooklyn and in New York and in New York State, because they will only ever have two senators. They will only, the formula for the Electoral College is not one for one, right? So it skews. And so the fact that we are continuing to urbanize actually hurts the people who are more likely to be going into those directions, which are more likely young liberals. And so it is broken. What we have on the horizon is a situation where we're very likely to see even more people winning the presidency who do not win the popular vote.
And Tom, we remember when the geography of this country did not determine politics as clearly as it does now. The most liberal Democrat of his time, George McGovern from South Dakota. Inconceivable now that George McGovern could be elected to anything from South Dakota. He got the Democratic presidential nomination as the senator from South Dakota. The Dakotas together don't have a population the size of Brooklyn, and yet they have 4 senators. This does not seem like there's a solution looming to this.
I don't think so. And as you were talking, Lawrence, I realized that a state I used to live in, Vermont, was within my lifetime a reliably Republican state, which would almost seem inconceivable now. I don't think there is a solution because the malady is within us, and because the nature of the Constitution is that it is so hard to change. And by the way, the one thing I don't think should be lost in this conversation is we don't ever want to lose the protections against majoritarian tyranny either. We don't want to live in a country where 51% of the people decide that the First Amendment's a bad idea, that the First Amendment goes. But I think that the problem is that this whole system was never designed to deal with millions upon millions of people who have pretty much just kind of lost their minds. And I don't know I wish I had an answer. I don't know what to do about that.
None of us have the answer to them losing their minds. Charles Blow, Tom Nichols, thank you both very much for joining us. This discussion must and will continue. Thank you very much.